Here, testing, testing. Well, did that excite you? Well, if it wasn't obvious already, today's topic is horror games. Well, before we get into the nitty gritty of the genre itself, why don't we look at what exactly are horror games? Now, most people would ask, why do they even exist? Do people want to get scared? Is it the excitement, the rush of adrenaline? Well, all of those answers are yes, since more and more horror games are produced every year, and more people play them. Now that I've gone over why we play these games, let's delve deeper into the actual games themselves and the history of the horror genre. The earliest rudimentary attempt at a horror game dates back to as early as 1972, when a haunted house overlay was included with the first ever commercial video game console, the Magnavox Odyssey, which was inspired by haunted house fiction. Some of the earliest horror games include Shark Attack, released in 1972, which was a Sega arcade machine where a shark moves around the playing field and the player has to shoot it with a spear gun. It has a series of slides on a wheel that make the shark move and thrash around when shot. The game features electronic sound and 8-track player. And if sea-based horror experiences didn't meet your need for some adrenaline, there was always Haunted House, released in 1972 as an arcade machine, and later would become one of the first home horror games played on home console, the Magnavox Odyssey. The arcade machine itself had a variety of features, such as 3 unique targets, that being of a cat, a witch, and a grave robber. Well, it's one way to make a living, I guess. Other features include a 3D playing field, blacklight lighting, and most impressively of all for its time, gun recoil and adaptive difficulty. And if that didn't meet your needs for a horror-based video game at that time, well, it looks like you were looking for an out-of-world experience, which moves us into our next early horror game, Space Invaders. Wait, what? Well, that's surprising. Would have thought Atari's E.T. would be considered one at this point. The most notable of these games so far, Space Invaders, is in fact so well known, the aliens from this game are featured as an emoji amongst most smartphones today. Taito's Space Invader, released in 1978, has been cited as a precursor to horror games, as it involved a survival scenario where an alien invasion slowly descends and increasingly destroys the landscape, while menacing sound effects gradually speed up, which created a sense of panic in players when it was first released. Well damn, I guess it really is a horror game when you put it like that. It seems like even in gaming's earliest days, developers have already been exploring different mediums and territories to set their games in. Well, I suppose the unknown is the scariest thing to most people. Now that we've gone over a brief history of the horror genre, let's go into the different subgenres of horror games. Kicking things off, or in some cases punching boulders off, with survival horror. One of the best defined and most common types of horror games are survival horror games. These games tend to focus on the survival of the player character in a horror setting with limited resources, and thus tend to be more geared as an action or action-adventure game. Not to be confused with action horror games that we'll get into later. A common theme of these games is escape or survival from the equivalent of a zombie apocalypse, utilizing weapons, ammunition, and limited armor. The Resident Evil series coined the term and serves as a prime example of such games. Other examples of horror games include the Outlast series, created by Phil Morin, founder of Red Barrel Studios, and initially released on September 4th, 2013. Amnesia: The Darkest Descent, created by The Chinese Room and released in 2010. The excellent Silent Hill, initially released in 1999, which had legendary game developer Hideo Kojima on its development staff. Just to list off a few more games, Dead Space, Little Nightmares, Alien Isolation, and an incredible amount of other amazing titles fit into this subgenre, which also include a cult favorite, Five Nights at Freddy's. Tracking back to Resident Evil, when most people think survival horror, more often than not they would say Resident Evil as their first choice, as they should, since at this point it's a classic. Resident Evil, released as Biohazard in Japan, began development in 1993 when Capcom's Tokuro Fujiwara told Shinji Mikami and the other co-workers to create a game using game elements from his 1989 game Sweet Home. In late 1994, marketing executives were setting up to release Biohazard in the United States. It was pointed out that securing the rights to the name Biohazard would be very difficult, as a New York hardcore rock band called Biohazard had already had the name. Thus, a contest was held amongst company and personnel to choose a new name. This competition resulted in the name Resident Evil, which not only ended up being its name in the West, but the name most fans know it as today. After Biohazard's name changed to Resident Evil, it made its debut on the PlayStation in 1996 and was later ported to the Sega Saturn. The first entry in the series was also the first game to be dubbed a survival horror, a term coined for the new genre it initiated, and its critical and commercial success, which led to the production of two sequels, Resident Evil 2 in 1998 and Resident Evil 3 Nemesis in 1999. Despite earlier announcements, the next game in the series would be released for the PlayStation 2, which resulted in the creation of an unrelated title, Devil May Cry. To this day, Resident Evil is still just as popular, with its latest entry in the series, Resident Evil Village, otherwise known as Resident Evil 8, where many fans of the series were excited to get their hands on the game and survive a certain very tall vampire lady with certain assets. The interest in this latest installment serves to prove that this subgenre is still alive, or should I say undead. Speaking of the undead, why don't we take a more action-oriented approach? Action horror games are a spin-off of survival horror games, with more action game elements borrowing from first-person and third-person shooter games. These elements are used alongside with survival horror themes, making them more fast-paced than prior survival horror games. These games grew in popularity following the release of Resident Evil 4 in 2005 and persisted in the next two titles, Resident Evil 5 and Resident Evil 6. With gameplay that focused more on action-oriented combat than puzzles and problem-solving from previous titles, examples of action horror games include the House of Dead series, the Dead Space series, Left 4 Dead series, and The Last of Us, and later the Doom series. Doom is one of the most significant games in video game history, frequently cited as one of the greatest games ever. Along with its predecessor, Wolfenstein 3D, it helped define the FPS genre and inspired numerous similar games, often called Doom clones. It pioneered online distribution and technologies including 3D graphics, networked multiplayer, and support for custom modifications via packaged WAD files, although its graphic violence and hellish imagery drew controversy. With its latest installment, Doom Eternal not only receiving praise by critics, but also by its fanbase and those who just enjoy action games with demonic elements and gore, with a challenging yet fun amount of difficulty. Without a doubt, if the Doom series continues after its final DLC, The Ancient Gods Part 2, where we saw the conclusion to the Slayer's rebooted journey that began in 2016, fans won't be disappointed when it returns, unlike myself during the 2020 Game Awards.
The category of Best Art Direction, The Last of Us Part 2. For Best Score and Music, The Last of Us Part 2. The Best Audio Design nominees are The Last of Us Part 2. Innovation and Accessibility, The Last of Us Part 2. In the category of Best Narrative, The Last of Us Part 2.
Moving on, our next subgenre, psychological horror. Psychological horror games are meant to scare the player through emotional, mental, or psychological states rather than through monsters or scares. The fear comes from what is not seen, rather than what is. These games commonly rely on the player character's unreliable perceptions or questionable sanity in order to develop the story. Through the use of unreliable narrators, such games may explore the fear of losing one's capacity to think rationally, or even to recognize one's own identity. Psychological horror games may not depend as much on action compared with survival horror games, instead giving time for the player to explore and witness events. The Silent Hill series, which is also based on survival horror elements, is considered one of the defining psychological horror games. Such games may also take advantage of the video game medium to break the fourth wall and appear to affect the player's computer or console directly, such as the Eternal Darkness and Doki Doki Literature Club. Seeing as Silent Hill is one of the featured psychological horror games, let's talk more about that. Konami published Silent Hill had an all-star dev team, with the legendary Hideo Kojima as one of its designers. Although Silent Hill was centered on a series of survival horror games created by Kiichiro Toyama, developed and published by Konami, the first 4 video games in the series, Silent Hill 2, Silent Hill 3, and Silent Hill 4 The Room, were developed by an internal group called Team Silent, which was a development staff within former Konami subsidiary Konami Computer Entertainment Tokyo. Geez, say that 6 times. Later, 6 other games would be produced: Silent Hill Origins, Homecoming, Shattered Memories, Downpour, Book of Memories, and finally PT, a Silent Hill playable teaser that was later cancelled with much to the fans' disappointment. But there is hope for this cancelled game in this foggy mess, since on the 4th of October, Games Radar reported that Kojima Productions would be developing the next Silent Hill game. Alright, that's the last jump scare. Our next subgenre we'll be looking at is JumpScare Horror, which was popularized by YouTubers and their reactions to these games. JumpScare horror games are designed around moments aimed to immediately surprise or shock the player when they least expect it, as well as creating a sense of dread while anticipating the next jump scare. While jump scares may be elements in other horror games along with other gameplay aspects, jump scare horror games are generally limited to this type of gameplay mechanism. They are often aimed towards generating reaction from players which have proven popular to watch over streaming platforms. Five Nights at Freddy's, otherwise known as FNAF, is considered one of the main examples of this style of game. Five Nights at Freddy's, developed by Scott Cawthon and initially released on August 2014, is one of 9 survival horror games taking place in locations somehow connected to family pizza restaurant Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. In most games, the player takes on the role of a nighttime employee, who must utilize tools such as security cameras, lights, doors, and vents to defend himself against hostile animatronic characters that inhabit the locations. The series' canon is revealed through voice recordings, minigames, and Easter eggs found throughout these games. Said canon can be further explored through a series of spin-off games in other media, including a novel trilogy and an anthology series, comprising of an all-encompassing fictional universe. A film adaptation based on the series is also planned and has currently started filming, with Chris Columbus, known for the Home Alone series, as its director. It seems that the FNAF series continues to live on with their upcoming game FNAF Security Breach, set to release later this year. Even with a seeming end to the series from its latest game, Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator, it looks like the main antagonist of the series was right.
I always come back.
Our final subgenre sees the player turning the tables, where the hunted becomes the hunter. We'll be delving deeper into the reverse horror genre next. Reverse horror games involve the player scaring other players, rather than the player being scared themselves. Compared to a traditional horror game, the player in this case would be considered the antagonist. Reverse horror games generally involve assuming the role of a monster or villain, instead of the victim. The main character in most cases has some sort of advantage over the others, such as enhanced vision, greater strength, or supernatural abilities. In some cases, reverse horror games may also derive from an original horror game developed as a sequel or prequel to the original, intended to display the perspective of the titular antagonist. Examples of reverse horror games include Carrion and the asymmetric multiplayer modes in Dead by Daylight and Friday the 13th the game, in which one player controls the monster that is chasing the other players. Dead by Daylight being an amazing example of the subgenre, since the game also features classic horror game characters such as Nemesis and good old Pyramid Head from Resident Evil and Silent Hill respectively. With constant updates to the game and a steadily growing player base, it seems the entity won't have any trouble finding new hunters. I personally am hoping they add FNAF Springtrap as one of their featured killers. All in all, it seems that the horror genre itself is filled with diverse and spooky ways to spike up your adrenaline and feed your craving for all things creepy. With all the new horror games coming out later this year and early next year, I'm confident when I say that the horror genre is certainly not dead, especially with the introduction of VR technology improving the horror experience and giving players a new perspective on their favorite horror games. If you enjoyed this video on the horror genre, be sure to like and subscribe to be the first one to view our next video about the sports genre.